Hey there. Today's podcast is all about Walt Disney. I'm talking with filmmaker Tony Cortese about his upcoming documentary, Walt Disney, Master of Dreamers, which sounds amazing. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 52 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. And as Disney fans, we've learned so much about Walt Disney's life through books, films, visiting important places like Marceline. There's a lot of ways to find out what he was about. And you also have massive biographies by people like Bob Thomas or Neil Gabler. And of course, you have documentaries like the PBS documentary, the 4-hour one that was done a little while back. Even so, with all of that information, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what we know about Walt Disney. I think there's a great opportunity, even zoning in on films, to look at specific parts of Walt's life. A good example is Christian Moran, who's been on this podcast, and his film Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, where he dove into just Walt's technological advances. And I think that's also the case with the film that Tony Cortese is making, Walt Disney, Master of Dreamers, which focuses in on what Walt did in the late 50s and particularly in the 1960s with the World's Fair and with his plans for Epcot. I love the idea of really focusing in on a certain period. And then also Tony is getting interviews with people that knew Walt directly, like Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump and Richard Sherman, people that knew him better than anyone else. And I'm also excited to have Tony back because he was on this podcast before. I spoke with Tony on episode 14 about his film Dreamfinders, which was about people that had moved to Orlando to be closer to the mouse. Tony's an excellent filmmaker. If you've seen his time-lapse videos of Walt Disney World, those are gorgeous. And that gives me more excited for this documentary. Beyond just the content about Walt Disney, I also can tell, even from the brief trailer that's online, that it's going to be something special from a visual perspective. I actually talked to Tony this time from the Magic Kingdom. I was home here in St. Louis, but Tony was sitting at the Magic Kingdom. And I do want to say that that does lead to a little bit of sound issues, a few words here and there cut out, but I think it's definitely worth it to hear the ambiance of being at the Magic Kingdom. So let's hop on the monorail and go to the Magic Kingdom and talk to Tony Cortese. We last spoke about 2 years ago, about Dreamfinders when it was released. And I know back then you just moved to Orlando. So what's it been like to live there close to the parks for a few years?
Oh, it's been great. You know, it's what I've always kind of dreamed of, to be so close to the Disney parks. I recently bought a home in Winter Garden. In the morning, I can actually hear the Magic Kingdom train whistle going, and at night, I've got a great view of the Magic Kingdom fireworks. So it's just great just being here in Central Florida and being just close to the Disney parks where you can just always kind of pop in whenever you feel like it. And that's really the reason I moved to Florida. My background is obviously filmmaking, but I've also got a long history of web design and development. So I keep myself pretty busy. And it's the Orlando area is just so happening. And it's just great to be down here. This time of year, it's a little steamy.
Yeah.
I have to say, like right now, I'm actually talking to you here from Magic Kingdom. I'm sitting at the tables outside of Pecos Bill and Adventureland, or in the between Adventureland and Frontierland, and it's just great to be able to do that. I had been vacationing down here for so many years. It's just nice to be down here full time. So yeah.
I can imagine. I'm jealous just hearing you there because being able to talk to somebody in the Magic Kingdom is awesome, but the fact that you're able to do that, it sounds amazing. I mean, has your view changed? Like I've heard other people that are locals talk about when they're there so much that you visit the parks differently. Has how you looked at the parks changed, probably for the better, but a lot since you've been there?
Oh, yeah. I think the one thing that you realize is, when you come down here as a vacationer, you've got a week or whatever, that small window is, and you try to squeeze everything in. When you're living down here, you tend to be able to, be much more selective as to when you come into the parks. I try to get in about once a week. I'm definitely at one park or in once a week, maybe twice a week. But, it takes a while to get out of vacation mode, and to kind of get back into just being a Florida local. And certainly, when you're down here often and you try to spread it out a little bit so you don't get burned out, because it does tend to blend together. But what I love is just seeing all the families and who are on vacation, this might be their first time down here, and just appreciating being down here. And I just love meeting and talking to people when I'm in the parks.
Well, that's great, because I understand that completely. I've always been those families, so getting to talk to someone on the other end is always cool for sure. And I wanted to talk to you, especially today, like I mentioned in the introduction, about Master of Dreamers, which I know you're currently working on, and it sounds really exciting. For me, as someone who's really into Epcot and the World's Fair and Walt Disney, I'm not sure that almost any movie could ever be more zoned in on what I'm interested in than that after seeing the trailer and everything. So what made you decide you wanted to do this project?
Well, that whole period of Walt Disney's life has always been what I've always kind of honed into. I think that what he was doing at the World's Fair was so important to the future of the Disney parks. And then, of course, that was sort of the springboard for his plans for Epcot and for what he was doing at Walt Disney World. Think about the World's Fair happened between 64 and then he went ahead and made the announcement that he had bought all this property in 66, and later that year he died. It was just there was so much going on during that period that I think it's important to understand what was going on in Walt Disney's head. He wasn't the same guy he was in the 30s and the 40s during his, big animation years, like when Snow White and Pinocchio and Bambi and all that were happening. But as he grew, he, just like everybody, everybody evolves and grows into a different person as you get older. And Walt's, okay, yeah, Magic Kingdom train passing by. As you get older, you just evolve into different ideas. And Walt Disney, I think, was, he always had he had a big interest in the future and technology and futuristic ideas. Doing what he was going to do in Florida, I don't really think people understand. I mean, maybe the hardcore Disney fans do, but the average fan doesn't really understand that Walt Disney had much bigger plans. He was kind of done with doing Disneyland. He didn't really like to do repeat performances or sequels. So he had done Disneyland, and that was kind of the end of that. So when he was planning Florida, he knew that he would do a theme park because they'd already done it. It was going to be easy. But the heart of Florida was not going to be Magic Kingdom. It was going to be Epcot. And Epcot was going to be, like a city of the future. As crazy as that sounds to a lot of people, when you look at the history behind it, Walt Disney had prepared himself to really push America, particularly America, because he really felt that American corporations were going to solve a lot of the problems that we were having in our country during that time. He thought technology, particularly American technology, would solve that. So he had studied urban planning very much. He was listening to people like James Rouse and Victor Gruen, and all these people were really established urban planners. And Walt Disney really felt that he wanted to contribute to the future of America, and what better way to do that than to create a city that was really technologically advanced with transportation and just an overall overview of what America needed at that time. It was the 60s, you know. The 60s were a cool time in America. It was a time of hope and dreams, technology, and, you know, you could talk to somebody over the phone and see their face. And all these different things that were happening, Walt loved. So I think that, for me, was what interests me most about Walt Disney. I mean, I love the movies and the films, but I just love the fact that he did Disneyland. It was amazing. He blew everybody away. And then he said, you know, time to shift gears. You know, and it's not like it was a conscious thing. He just kept going. He just kept looking inward to himself. And the whole urban planning thing for what he was planning on doing for Epcot was amazing. So with the film Master of Dreamers, I thought, you know, let's look at that. You know, let's look at his team after he died and how they were trying to interpret what he wanted to do for Epcot, because all people really had was that film that he put out. But there were so many different things to consider when building a city. Building a city, think about that. He wanted to build a city of the future.
It's crazy. It's the more I hear about Epcot the city and what he had planned, even just from the Epcot film and then Sam Gennawey's book and other areas, it confounds me. But, you know, the weird thing about it is, at least for me, is people had the same reactions to Disneyland. So to us now, we look at it like, what? They were going to, a company? Because corporations, like you mentioned, are viewed a little differently now. I mean, for you, after doing all this research on the film, I mean, do you think the city would have worked? I mean, could he have done even close to what he envisioned in those films and some of the planning we've seen?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that it would have worked. You needed Walt Disney to package that whole deal. You know, he had it all in his head. And what the challenge was getting corporations like Westinghouse and General Electric and General Motors all to sit together in one room and share ideas. That's what he wanted. He wanted them to share ideas and come up with some really incredible technological advances that wouldn't have otherwise been possible unless they were together sharing ideas. And there was no one who could have done that than Walt Disney. You've got people like Victor Gruen, who was you know, an urban planner, you know, back in the day. And, you know, he was also very good friends with Ray Bradbury. So Walt loved that whole kind of looking into the future type of thing. What he wanted to do was very, very different than what had ever been done. I mean, you know, when they bought all the property in Florida, they bought that, and, you know, nobody knew they were buying it until after it was kind of already done. They bought all that property, which ended up being twice the size of the island of Manhattan, as Walt says. You know, what they wanted to do, and you know, the state of Florida would have done anything for them, because who knew about Florida in, you know, 1965? Who was even going to Florida? Nobody. You know, I mean, you might go down there to go to the beach, but Florida was nothing back in those days. It was all swampland. I mean, Miami was kind of happening, but Central Florida was nothing. You know, he figured, I've got all this land here. I don't want to have to apply for a permit every time I want to do something, every time I want to put up a structure or drain a lake or whatever. So he proposed, him and his brother Roy, that they essentially create their own government. They wanted total autonomy down here. And the pitch was to create the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which would have been the organization which Disney would have used to work towards all their expansions and all their new ideas. And Florida was happy to give it to them. I mean, think about it. They created their own government. But, you know, when his Imagineers got together after Walt died and said, you know, how are we going to do this? You know, Walt's not here to lead us. Walt's not here to guide us. They just couldn't figure out how to get through the zoning stuff, voting, you know, schools. If people are going to live in Epcot, where are the kids going to go to school? I mean, there were so many different levels of, you know, you're creating your own government, right? You needed Walt Disney to really be able to craft that. He was just a master at that. He wasn't just this film guy. He had much, much bigger ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed. I mean, I think what they ended up doing with Epcot Center was impressive. It was more kind of like the World's Fairs, where, I mean, it's been described as a permanent World's Fair. Walt Disney World and Epcot Center, the fact that they moved that forward is still kind of stunning given that Walt wasn't involved. How do you think Epcot Center really connects to what Walt wanted? I mean, is the spirit still there?
Oh, yeah. No, it's all about keeping communication and technology alive. And yes, Epcot is sort of a permanent World's Fair, but Walt loved World's Fairs. He really did. It was a place for him to expo his ideas. And, for the Disney Imagineers who were tasked to be able to create something, to try to figure out what he was trying to do with his original idea for Epcot, I think they got it right. They originally labored for a long time. They would have these Wednesday morning meetings, which we'll talk about in the Master of Dreamers documentary. And they were kind of like brainstorm meetings, an open forum to just figure out how we're going to do this. And then they just said, you know what? We just need to shelve Epcot for now because we don't know. And then later on, the Florida State Legislature, this is back, you got to remember, Magic Kingdom was opened in, 71?
Yeah.
So right after they opened Magic Kingdom, they went right into trying to figure out how to do Epcot. They knew how to do Magic Kingdom. It was just a carbon copy of Disneyland, but just bigger. So when they thought, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and figure out Epcot, they were hitting roadblocks. They just didn't know how to do it the way Walt wanted, because there were just, as Bob Gurr, who I interviewed several times, said to me, one question would unravel 10 questions. You'd answer one question and then you'd have 10 questions that would follow it, because there was just so many things that you had to consider when creating your own government. Progress City, right?
Yeah.
So they figured that, okay, we're going to shelve Epcot for now. And then several years later, in the late 70s, Florida said, hey, guys, we gave you this total autonomy here because you told us you were going to build Epcot. So what are we going to do? And as the story goes, Card Walker may have sent an email or a message to Marty Sklar. I don't think emails were around in the 80s.
No, probably not.
Maybe he sent them a memo, and said, hey, what's going on with Epcot? Are we going to do this or not? And Marty said, okay, let's figure it out. So when they approached it the second time, they approached it as, we're going to do this as a theme park, but we want to do it in the same vein that Walt was interested in. So, and we don't have enough time to really talk about all the logistics on that. If you when you see the film, we're going to go into great detail as to how they decided to do a world showcase, how they decided to do a future world, and why they set the place up the way that they did, why it was kind of a park split in half. But Walt loved, he loved World's Fairs. And Epcot is essentially a permanent World's Fair that gets reskinned and updated every once in a while. And I think Walt would be very proud of it.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm fascinated to see the movie, especially after seeing the trailer that you put out there and just seeing Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump and everyone talk about it. I'm like, this is going to be great. And especially the fact that you're going to talk about what they did with Epcot is really cool. And you mentioned World's Fairs, and the big event, obviously, for Disney that led to a lot of this was the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, which Walt put together with his Imagineers 4 attractions that led into directly 3 at Disneyland that would then go on to other parks. You mentioned that Walt loved World's Fairs. Why do you think he connected so strongly with them and focused so much on that New York event?
Well, that's a great question. East Coast audiences were not that receptive to Disney films back in the early days. They didn't really do that well on the East Coast. As their numbers indicated, there were only roughly 2% of people east of the Mississippi who had ever been to Disneyland. So they didn't really know how Disneyland was, Disney-style entertainment was going to be received on the East Coast. And the World's Fair was a great way for Walt to present his style of entertainment, the things that they were doing in Disneyland, the types of things they were doing there, to East Coast audiences. And obviously they were very well received. I think that the kind of more of the sophisticated Manhattan type audiences maybe weren't as interested in the kind of, as Walt would call it, kind of corny. It's funny. I saw an interview with his son-in-law, Ron Miller, who was married to Diane Disney, and there were some reviews about one of the films he put out, and the New York Times said it's just corny. And Walt and his son-in-law Ron, they were having lunch together, and he said to him, "Well, Walt, did you see the review from the New York Times?" And Walt said, "Well, they don't understand that I like corn. I like corn. I like corny." So as far as the films go, that's what Walt did. It took what he was doing in Walt Disney World, I think, to open up, or rather at the World's Fair, to open up what he wanted to do in the East Coast. So it was a great springboard for him to test the East Coast audiences. And when he saw that they were very, very receptive to Disney-style entertainment, that was kind of the last nail in the coffin for him to say, these ideas, which, by the way, had probably been festering in his head, even from Disneyland. Because even when he did Disneyland in the 1950s, he was thinking about urban planning. He was thinking about Epcot. Everybody I talk to says Walt has a memory like an elephant. He could remember anything you said 20 years, 30 years down the road, he'll remember it. And he knew that Epcot was going to be, or at least, he didn't know it was going to be Epcot, but he knew that this whole kind of technological kind of path that he wanted to blaze into the future was going to be something that he was going to do. He just didn't know how he was going to put it together. But after the success of Disneyland, and we can talk about, how important that train trip that he did with Ward Kimball in the 60s was. He did a, here comes the train again.
It's okay. It's good ambiance.
Yeah. So, you familiar with the strike that happened? The animators screen,
yeah.
Was it the Screen Animators Screen Guild, or that was a tough time for him. And during that period, he wasn't feeling very well, and they told him, his doctors told him, you need to just get away and just take a vacation. So him and Ward Kimball went on the train, went to Chicago, and saw a train convention or a trade show. And it was that trip that really, I think, inspired Walt about trains. And then he went and built that little kind of village in his backyard with scale model trains that he had the studio make for him. And that was his way of kind of crafting what he was going to do for Disneyland. But also during that time, he was thinking about beyond Disneyland. He was very, very much into technological ideas. Walt was a complex guy, man. He had a lot of things going on in his head. And like Bob Gurr says, he didn't tell everybody that was going on, He would set people at the task at hand, and, they would go ahead and be Walt's kind of soldiers on the ground, his boots on the ground. But Walt had a lot of plans that he was always working on. That whole business with Abraham Lincoln at the World's Fair. Nobody knew they were doing that. He was trying to get these guys who were working in his machine shop to build an Abraham Lincoln animatronic, because at the time all they had was the tiki birds from Enchanted Tiki Room. But to get an Abraham Lincoln, like a full-size animatronic, to actually stand up out of a seated position was something that it was just very difficult to do. They didn't know how to do it, and they were having big problems. So Walt brought Bob Gurr, and the way Bob explains it, and again, this is something that we talk about in the film in Master of Dreamers, is Bob, they took him in a secret room that they had in the studio. It was like a private, it was like under lock and key. And there they had this Abraham Lincoln animatronic that was like this big debacle. And Bob immediately, because he was a designer, an aerodynamic designer of airplanes and cars, immediately knew that he looked at this body of Lincoln and he looked at it as an airplane fuselage. And when he saw that, he immediately knew that he could do working. Walt, I think, said to him, Bobby, he used to call him Bobby, which I love. When Bob tells the story, it's great.
Yeah.
Bobby, I want half as much weight and twice as much motion. And Bob immediately saw it as an airplane fuselage. And he stripped it down and rebuilt it. And they had an audio animatronic Abraham Lincoln at the 1964 World's Fair. People thought it was a real person. They were throwing ball bearings at it in the audience.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't believe that it was not real. So the guy was going on in his head at any given time.
Yeah, that's a great story, and it's sort of fascinating to think about how quickly, too, because I remember I've heard the stories that, they got Mr. Lincoln, the animatronic, out to test, and then it didn't work at all. It basically, looked like he was bleeding because of the fluid. I mean, the fact that they did that so quickly, all of those attractions were put together so fast. And I know it's a completely different era than now where you have so many layers of management. And so there's no Walt, there's not even really a Bob Gurr or something. You've got so many more people. But technologically, I just can't believe what they did in such a short time. I mean, how did they pull that off?
Well, as Bob tells me, Walt had a very unique way of working. He was very engaged. Unlike CEOs today who sit at their desk and have a team of other people who do their leg and then report back to them. So as a result, you've got a series of filters that are going up and down the chain of command. There were no filters with Walt. He was, on the ground level with the boots on the ground. He knew what needed to happen, and more importantly, he knew how to team people up together. He knew how to team people that would be the best that they could be to accomplish the task at hand. They did Small World, which was the last of the attractions for the 1964 World's Fair, in 9 months. They were already working on Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and we talked about the technology that was required to make that happen. They did the Ford Magic Skyway, which created the first ride system that would be later used for the People Mover, which was supposed to be one of the main sources of transportation for Walt's Epcot, and then later would be kind of evolved into the Omni Mover system, which you see at most of the dark rides today. And then, of course, Carousel of Progress, which was another, audio animatronic show, but the stage was so unique, the way it would revolve around. And then finally, in 9 months before the World's Fair was going to open, Pepsi, and there's a story that Joan Crawford was actually the one who, had connections with some of the executives at Pepsi and said, hey, you need to get Walt Disney to help you guys get into the fair. So Pepsi reached out to Walt Disney, and he said, yeah, we'll do a Burns boat ride. And his team was like, what? We're already overtasked. How are we going to do this in 9 months? But they did. And it was because Walt was so engaged. He was so engaged. You just don't see that in leadership today. I think you probably saw that with a Steve Jobs. I think you saw that with a Steve Wynn. I think you might have a Steven Spielberg, a leader who does not rely on his people below him to report to him. He is the one who's fully engaged because he can see the progress right away, and he can immediately jump in and switch gears and save time in production. That's what was, I think, very unique about Walt Disney. He was very, very hands-on, and that's why they were able to do 4 shows for the New York World's Fair. And the World's Fair, on all the pavilions and everything, they just bulldozed everything. But Walt was smart enough to say, you know what, we're going to take these shows and all the equipment and construction, and we're going to bring them back to California, and we're going to use them in Disneyland. And just imagine that he had such foresight to know that. They didn't care, but he knew, I'm going to get these guys to pay for the show. They're going to pay me for the show, and then after it's done, I get to take it back and put it in Disneyland. And think about what he learned from all that. I mean, he created that whole business model of corporate sponsorships for theme parks.
It's brilliant what he did there. And it tells you something, that those attractions, either lasted for a really long time. Some of them are still playing. It's a Small World is all over the world. You've got Carousel of Progress still playing at Disney World. It's crazy. And even some of the Magic Skyway ended up in the train. The setup is basically very similar to what they do at Disneyland with the train ride and what you see there. So it's stunning what they were able to do. And I know you mentioned Bob Gurr, but there are others that are on equal stature that are going to be in your film, like Richard Sherman and Rolly Crump. And so how did you figure out who you wanted to include? Like, who were the people that you really wanted to target? What was kind of your goal for this film?
Well, quite honestly, they were the last ones who were still alive. These guys are champions for Walt. They really are. They've made it there to the legacy of Walt Disney alive. Bob is out there all the time, constantly talking the talk. Richard Sherman, you've seen him everywhere. Rolly Crump, they're all getting so old now. I'm thankful that I was able to get to them when I did. I would have loved to have Marty. I would have loved to get Dick Nunis. Dick doesn't really do these types of things. Dick Nunis, if he ever writes a book, I'll tell you right now, that'll be the book to end all books.
Yeah, it would be. He's such... You don't ever hear anything about him, really, beyond from history.
No, he flies way under the radar. He really doesn't like to come out unless it's necessary. Mark Davis, would have loved to grab him. Hello. It's just... They're the last of the Mohicans. They really are. And they are, even in the twilight of their years, are very much assertive in keeping Walt's legacy alive. Being with Richard Sherman was beyond a treat. He played and sang for us privately. All that stuff is going to be included in the film in Master of Dreamers. His story of Mary Poppins, of how he met Walt and how Walt knew that they were the right ones for the job. Walt didn't just write the music to Mary Poppins. They literally came up with the storyline to the film. Mary Poppins was nothing but a book of short adventure stories that really had no underlying story to it. And they took those and created a story and then presented it to Walt. And then Walt, they had, there was half a dozen chapters in this book out of, 12 or 13 chapters. And the Sherman brothers had identified and outlined, I think, 6 of the chapters that they thought were the most important that could be used to create a story about this Mary Poppins character. And then Walt pulled out his copy of Mary Poppins and had also underlined the same 6 chapters. So they were both on the same page, and immediately, and again, Walt brought them in because he saw something in them, and they were inspired to show him the best that they could do. And that's what all his Imagineers did. They were all inspired and always motivated to show Walt the best that they can do. What an amazing thing that is.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I wanted to make sure to mention you're having a really cool event in Anaheim on October 13th with Rolly Crump and Bob Gurr and others to help support the film. Can you talk a little bit about that event?
Yeah, well, the event is on October 13th. It is in Anaheim, just a couple of blocks from Disneyland. The website is masterofdreamers.com, masterofdreamers.com. And this show is going to be a panel discussion with Rolly, who unfortunately can't make it there in person, so we're going to Skype him in. It will be Roley, Bob Gurr, who will be there in person, also Garner Holt, who is the audio animatronics sort of pioneer, done so much audio animatronics work. Jeff Barnes, who is an author of The Wisdom of Walt and also teaches the only college-accredited course on Walt Disney, California. And also Sam Gennawey, who I love Sam because he has a real unique perspective when it comes to Epcot. Sam is a urban planner in the city of Los Angeles and a big Disney geek. So being, taking his professional knowledge of urban planning and looking at what Walt was trying to do with Epcot is going to make for a real interesting conversation. We're going to have food, we're going to have drink, we're going to have a silent auction with some terrific Disney art that we're going to be auctioning. And we're also going to be, I'm good friends with Ken Keebow, who is the director of the short film Whimsical Imagineer, which is a film about Roley Crump. It's just a short 30-minute film on Roley. And Ken is going to be there, and we're going to screen Whimsical Imagineer with Roley's son, who will be there to answer questions after that. So it's really just going to be an evening of fellowship and just great friends who can appreciate the legacy of Walt Disney with all of Walt Disney's last living Imagineers, at least the ones that I could get to come on October 13th in Anaheim.
Well, great. Yeah, actually, Sam and Jeff and Ken actually have all been on this podcast, and having them all in one place with, a few Imagineers is really something special. So this has been awesome having you on the show, Tony. If people want to learn more about the movie or any other ways to support beyond that event, is there anything particular they should do?
Yeah. Have them just go to masterofdreamers.com. They can purchase tickets for the show. They can watch the trailer for the film Master of Dreamers, and they can get a better understanding of the film itself and what we're trying to do, which is, to keep Walt Disney's legacy alive.
Well, awesome. This has been great talking with you. I can't wait to see the movie, and thanks a lot, Tony.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
That was great. I love hearing the train go by in the background. It really places us right in the Magic Kingdom. And after talking with Tony, I'm more excited to see Master of Dreamers, which sounds amazing. And if you have a chance to get to his event on October 13th in Anaheim, that sounds incredible. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would suggest you check out the first podcast I had with Tony Cortese, where he was actually live from Disney's Hollywood Studios. Plus, there's episodes with Sam Gennawey and Jeff Barnes and Ken Keebow, all people that will be involved with that event. If you'd like to learn how to support the show, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/support. And there's a few different ways you can help to keep this podcast going. And of course, you can contact me by email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or reach out to me on Twitter @TomorrowSOC. And I also have pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest @Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music for this podcast is written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Check out Adam's CD of rock and pop songs at adamhucke.com. In 2 weeks, I will be talking with Brent Young of Super 78 Studios. He's also the co-host of the long-running Season Pass podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I will talk to you again very soon.